Russia's shown that it's not particularly able to reconstitute lots of tanks and armored fighting vehicles quickly. They've managed to refurbish a lot, but once those stockpiles are run through, which they're not far away from doing so, they've proven a lot less able to build new ones. Whereas they have proven quite able in building lots of cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, and one-way attack drones. So on average through 2025 so far, they're almost at around 100 cruise missiles, 50 ballistic missiles, and over 4,000 drones every month that the Ukrainian air defenses are having to deal with. And this is something that European militaries would struggle to contend with, particularly over the longer period, given that one of the main concerns, and this is something that we've struggled with in trying to get aid to the Ukrainians, is just how long it takes to build missile interceptors. There's a lot of bottlenecks in the supply chain. Manufacturing capacity is being ramped up, but not quickly enough for demand. And given that it's already struggling to keep up with demand, and European militaries are doubling the number of launches they're going to have over the next decade, it's a real area that needs increased efforts to meet the threat that the Russians could pose. And on the counter-UAS side, a lot of challenges in making it cost effective. You don't want to be using 100,000, 200,000 pound missiles against a drone that costs 10,000, 20,000 pounds, which is what happened when there was the incursion over Poland. We used pretty expensive air-to-air missiles to intercept those. So counter-UAS is also something that's being looked at, but again, the efforts probably need to be ramped up to fill that capability gap, especially given the challenge of a cheaper system tends to be shorter range, whether it's gun-based or cheaper rocket with precision guided kits added onto them, which have proven quite effective. But the problem is the range of those is quite small. So you either need a platform that's highly mobile, which the Ukrainians have explored with Humvees or sort of turboprop piston engined aircraft to get it to where it needs to be, or you need a lot of them strung out around the entirety of NATO's eastern frontier.
And we did see, as you mentioned there, those attacks into Poland with drones. It's not clear whether any of those drones were actually armed. And there's been much discussion of the very expensive kind of response to that initial drone incursion by Russia. Is it a matter of spending more on these quite large, expensive missile defences, or should there be more going into these smaller, newer technologies like drone interceptors, perhaps slightly cheaper jamming technologies, or does NATO have the kind of space and money and capability to build larger, more expensive systems and use those?
I think there's several elements to this. I think it's important to stress we still need more of the complex and expensive interceptors, especially ballistic missile defenses. There's very few of those in European NATO. The Patriot, which has performed quite well in Ukraine. It's an area that, given the peace dividend in the post-Cold War era and the needs of the war on terror, European NATO countries were not spending much on. So that's still an area that needs improving at the same time as developing alongside those the cheaper, more cost-effective and innovative. We've got directed energy weapons being developed, microwaves, lasers, which can prove very cost-effective, but there's a lot of work that needs to go into fielding those at scale and at the level they need to be. There's been a few sort of interesting developments. So British engineers were able to put together a few older, cheaper air-to-air missiles on sort of the Supercat truck that is built to form what they call the Raven system, which produces a pretty cost-effective air defense against drones. So there's a lot of options available. But unfortunately, we need to do both at the same time. And then to add to that, another gap that exists is what is called SEAD and DEAD, which is suppression of enemy air defenses and destruction of enemy air defenses. And you need to be able to do that in order to push back Russian launch platforms, destroy Russian launch platforms, and also potentially go after their manufacturing base. So, rather than having to deal with thousands of drones, if you were able to get missiles through to blow up Russian drone factories, then that would make life a lot easier. But unfortunately, the SEAD and DEAD capabilities of European NATO are another area which are in need of investment.
And in that Ukraine's sort of retaliatory long-range strike campaign into Russia, we've also seen a lot of strikes and quite a successful campaign on Russian energy export infrastructure. Is there anything in that for Europe to learn from? Because obviously it is perhaps controversial for NATO to be figuring out how to strike non-military targets within Russia. But at the same time, that seems to be the most effective way that Ukraine have come up with, at least, to limit Russia's offensive capability, or at least the funding for those offensive capabilities. Is there anything there that Europe will be looking into?
Well, deep strike for military targets is an area that a lot of European countries are very interested in developing. There's been a lot of orders for long-range, complex strike weapons, which are a very powerful deterrent in themselves. If Russia knows that its high-value military targets are held at risk, then they'd be a lot less likely to risk open conflict in the first place. But more of those systems are needed in the future, and the ability to whittle down Russia's air defenses to ensure that those weapon systems would be able to get through more successfully, working alongside each other. As for the strike campaign on Russian energy, government revenue is absolutely vital to the Russian war effort, and efforts that can be made to reduce that revenue would incredibly useful to reducing Russia's ability to prosecute the war over the longer term. I think so far the Ukrainian campaign has contributed to adding pain to the Russian coffers, but on its own it's not going to be enough. It's part of a wider campaign of reducing the Kremlin's ability to fund its military efforts, and that sits alongside NATO's efforts in peacetime in the situation we're in at the moment, which is not quite peacetime, not quite wartime, better efforts to force Russian economic pain, essentially. Sanctions have been introduced, but the impact has not been as strong as perhaps desired. There's showing signs of impact. The inflation in Russia is quite high, their deficit is growing, but they've proven quite resilient to bypassing the worst of the sanctions. You look at trade flows between Central Asian countries and European countries for dual-use goods, and they've gone through the roof. And if you look at, in particular, energy exports, from February 2022 to today, European countries have sent about 3 times as much money to Russia for hydrocarbons, despite the sanctions efforts, than they've given to Ukraine in aid.
And presumably in a scenario where Russia increases its levels of aggression directly on European or NATO allies, the sanctions regime would tighten up, would it not? Or is there a concern here that even in a situation where Russia carries out more incursions, more aggression, Europe still relies too heavily on those hydrocarbons to completely cut off Russia and actually deal any sort of significant deterrence economically?
I think there would be even tighter efforts, much tighter efforts, if it did come to open conflict. But it doesn't send a great deterrent signal that in the situation we're currently in, the efforts have not been anywhere near as strong as perhaps Ukraine and its supporters would have liked to have seen. It's a very complicated issue trying to enforce sanctions. I'm not a sanctions expert. You'd have to get lawyers in to give you all the details on quite how challenging it is to ensure that who you're selling to doesn't sell to someone, doesn't sell to someone, doesn't sell to someone. It could be several parties down the line before it ends up in the wrong hands. So it is challenging to properly enforce sanctions, but I think that with a bit more political will from European countries, it can certainly be tightened up. And the other situation which does send quite a strong deterrence to Russia is but a lot of the energy exports they do come through their shadow fleet, which uses routes through the Black Sea and through the Baltic Sea mostly to go to and from Russian ports. In the event of an open conflict with NATO, it would be very easy to close off those routes. However, with climate change, the Northern Sea Passage could potentially give Russia an alternative path, which weakens our ability to cut off their shipping and drive down government revenue. So that could weaken deterrence over the long run, which is another reason why sort of deep strike weapons add to the deterrence, because even if climate change opens up the Northern Sea route, NATO countries being able to close it off with military means does send a powerful deterrent to Russia in the future.
You've been watching or listening to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Louis Sykes. For more on the war in Ukraine, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel and sign up for a membership, or you can hear all the latest news and analysis on Times Radio or read it at thetimes.com. And remember, we are in both podcast and video form. You can find us on your favourite podcast platform. It's Times Radio's Frontline, or you can watch us on Times Radio's YouTube channel. Thanks very much. Goodbye.